And so this event is sponsored by the Project for an Informed Electorate and the Center for California Studies, both at Sacramento State. All of our panelists are political science professors at Sacramento State. It's going to be different than other kind of postmortem panels in that these folks are going to be talking about things that they actually do research on. And so there will be some insights that you wouldn't get from just pundits, we hope. The other thing is, just for housekeeping, if you have any questions, and we hope people do, we're going to hold those to the end. And if you would type them into the Q&A. So if you go into the Q&A, we will be able to answer your questions. I will announce the questions to the group and we'll go from there. You can direct a question to a particular person, or you can direct a question to the panel. Again, type those into the Q&A and we'll do it that way. So we'll get going 1 second. Leonore Elling, the Center for California Studies, she's going to give us a couple words about upcoming events.
Thank you. And we're co-sponsoring this event with Dr. Nalder's group, Project for an Informed Electorate, and very happy to be here. Just wanted to plug an event we have coming up on December 1st on the Black Voter Project. It is a presentation by Dr. Towler, who's here on the panel today. I don't know if he wants to say very much, but I'll put information about how to register for that event. It's going to be here at the Downtown Center on 3rd and S Street, 304 S Street, and it'll be at noon. There'll be food available. You can also watch it live through live stream.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, well, let's get started with our panel. Our first presenter is Wesley Hussey. He's a professor of political science at Sacramento State, as is everyone. He specializes in American and California government and politics. He's a 2-time finalist for California's Citizens Redistricting Commission and served on the Sacramento City Independent Redistricting Commission in 2021. He earned his BA from UC Irvine and his PhD from UCLA. If you could go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Kim. Hello, everyone. I want to start by talking about kind of where we thought this midterm would go and then where it ended up going. And a lot of talk, of course, was about redistricting and gerrymandering. There was a discussion about, more states were under Republican control than Democrat states. So there was this thought that Republicans would win the redistricting cycle, that they'd be able to have more House seats redistricted in a way that they could win than the Democrats. But as the process went over state by state, the Republicans didn't have as much of an advantage as everyone first thought. Part of that was that Republicans did have a lot more states where they gained seats, but a lot of those seats were gained because those states had a large non-white majority or non-white population grow much further than the white population. So like in Texas and in other places, new seats had to be created that accommodated that. And that was not as helpful to the Republicans as everyone thought. And so maybe into the summer, late summer, the kind of consensus among pundits and academics was the Republicans had a slight advantage when all the states were added together with redistricting, but not much of one. But then there was these two things that happened that gave Republicans a little bit of an edge. The first is that New York State, which was clearly a Democratic gerrymander, a way the Democrats had drawn the districts to help their congressional delegation, was thrown out by a judge. A judge felt like that it was an unfair partisan gerrymander, and New York had to immediately redistrict in a way that was more neutral and fair, which kind of got rid of this Democratic advantage everyone was hoping for. And the other was in Florida, Republicans had already redistricted and maybe even gerrymandered in a way to help them. But the Governor Ron DeSantis, did not like the maps, and he thought it should be even more Republican. So the Florida Republicans went through a second round of redistricting and ultimately, moved from like a partial gerrymander to a pretty strong gerrymander. And we think maybe that gave them, those two states just by themselves, an additional 6 seats heading into the election. And so far, we're looking like the Republicans are going to pick up 8 seats. So pretty much the entire Republican net gain from this election is going to be because of the demise of the Democratic partisan gerrymander in New York, and then the additional secondary gerrymander Republicans got in Florida. And if you think of it that way, that pretty much erases all of the Republican gains in this election. I want to talk a little bit about the House elections, though. We usually see the opposition party do really well. They pick up seats. In fact, over the past 100 years, the opposition party from the White House usually picks up 29 seats. So 8 seats is not just small, it's historically one of the smallest ever. And that should just show you how little the Republicans gained in this election compared to other midterm elections as the opposition party. Republicans failed to pick up a seat in the Senate, just the 7th time in the last 100 years that the opposition party has failed to do that. And part of that might be talked about by my colleagues a little bit later and some of the exit polls and information. But part of it also was the Republican Party chose very conservative candidates in their primary, particularly the Senate, backed by former President Donald Trump. And that made it much more difficult to compete in the general election. Pretty much all of the House candidates that Trump chose in contested Republican primaries lost. And then in the general election, and then mainly most of the candidates he chose in Senate Republican primaries lost in the general election, including Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, which was a fundamental mistake by Republicans because they had a very credible, more moderate candidate, and the actual vote totals in Pennsylvania were so close that really anything could have moved that needle, including a different candidate. But also we had cases where the Republicans threw out in a Republican primary a moderate Republican in Washington in the 3rd district, Jamie Herrera Butler, and the Democrats then picked up that seat. So that was a mistake. You have this safe seat for Republicans and they threw it away. By the way, the Democrats did the same thing, not in Washington state, but in Oregon, one state down. In the Democratic primary, the Democrats knocked off Kurt Schrader of the Oregon 5th, and then Republicans picked up that seat. So we're actually seeing interesting cases on both sides, but I'd say there's more cases on the Republican side where extremists are pushing in the primaries more extreme candidates, and they're winning in the primary, and then they're having a tougher time in the general election to actually come back and have a chance. Nationally, and we haven't had all the votes in, particularly here in California, which is pretty democratic. Nationally, the Republicans have a slim advantage in the popular vote, and they have a slim advantage, all the votes when they're tallied for congressional races. So it's pretty close that way. And I think part of that was there were some partisan gerrymander Democratic states and partisan gerrymander Republican states. So on a national level, for the most part, it kind of equals out. So a slight Republican advantage in the popular vote is going to equal a slight Republican advantage in the House. But obviously, that's much less than the Republicans had hoped for, and maybe even 2-3 weeks ago, less than what polls had shown. I think a big winner that you've probably heard others talk about, of course, is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, not just winning large in Florida, which had historically been a swing state, but it's moving more Republican, but doing very well with Latinos. He won 57% of the Latino vote there, which is more than he won in 2018 and more than Trump won in 2020, which was a larger margin than Republicans usually do. And obviously that puts Trump in a very difficult position. DeSantis is rising. Trump's candidates for Senate and House didn't do very well, and that will be maybe an interesting situation develop as the Republican primary for president shapes up over these next 2 years. California is not a particularly interesting state in this election cycle. All the things we imagined happened, for the most part, happened. Democrats won all the statewide races. The initiatives weren't particularly interesting. We knew ahead of time that the gaming initiatives would go down to a big defeat. Democrats will still have a supermajority in the Assembly and the Senate. So sometimes California can be a really interesting harbinger of the future. In this case, we had a pretty good sense of what was going to happen since California is pretty democratic. The last thing I want to talk about before we get to hear from my other colleagues is just how well the Democrats did outside of congressional races. That is, across the country, they picked up dozens, if not tens of dozens of state legislative seats. They did well in the governor's races. For the first time since the 1980s, they won back the Michigan legislature. And the Republicans picked up not a single state legislature across the country. So this was a real big failure, I think, for the Republican Party in this midterm. They didn't do well in the national congressional elections. They didn't do well locally across the nation. And they really struggled. And part of that, I think, was extreme candidates, but part of that, I think, was not as much of a mood to shift to the Republicans as we usually see in a midterm away from the White House party. And I think that's a really interesting thing to take away from this election. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Hussey. By the way, he's pronouncing gerrymander correctly. Most people say gerrymander, but technically it's gerrymander, so a little something to remember. Professor Daniel Jostin Martin is next, and she's an associate professor of political science here. Her research and teaching focus on American political behavior and campaigns and elections specifically.
Great, thank you. Today I'm going to talk about what issues were the most salient in the election. And so what issues were candidates and campaigns focusing on and talking about, and what issues actually motivated voters. So according to data from Ad Impact, the top issues for each party in terms of their campaign ad spending leading up to the election for Democrats were abortion, crime, and character. Really no surprises here. After the Dobbs decision this summer, Democrats have been focusing on abortion rights and access, and public opinion polls show that a majority of Americans don't support overturning Roe v. Wade. So it was smart of Democrats to try and capitalize on it. I'll come back to to crime, but character as an issue really means that the ads focused on the candidate's quality, level of quality. And so here they probably were focusing on Republicans' poor or low quality. As Professor Hussey noted, a lot of the Republicans who were nominated this year did have some scandalous histories, or they hadn't run for office before, or they were very conservative. So Democrats tried to capitalize on that. For Republicans, their top issues in terms of their campaign ad spending were taxation, crime, and Joe Biden. Taxation as an issue likely includes inflation and the economy. So the messaging probably was around, well, we can't afford more taxes or increases in taxes because inflation already is high. We can't afford that. And that's fairly typical for Republican candidates to run on taxes as an issue. And more generally, Americans typically think of Republicans as better able to deal with broader economic issues. Crime is a consistently salient issue among voters. It's typically their number 2 or 3 in terms of their top priorities. And that's probably why Republicans tried to capitalize on it. It likely was also then high on Democrats' ad spending as a response to Republicans. Otherwise, Democrats probably would not have been focusing on crime. That last issue for Republicans was focusing on President Biden, and that was smart of them because Biden's approval ratings were not great going into the election. And when the president is unpopular, typically their party does not do well in the election, as Professor Hussey noted. It's this retrospective way of voting, the idea being that voters decide whether they're better off now compared to when President Biden took office. So these were all the top issues that each party was running ads on, and it's a good bet that the candidates of each party were also discussing many of these issues on the campaign trail. Among national voter polls leading up to the election, the top issue, though, was the economy. So it seemed to favor Republicans, at least nationally, again, in those national polls. But 2 issues that many pundits thought had receded from prominence were democracy and abortion. And in the national polls leading up to the election, these issues were popular during the summer and early fall, which seemed to favor Democrats. Yet the closer we got to election day, the more the narrative was about the economy and the popularity of President Biden. And with good reason. Nationally, these looked like the issues that most voters were concerned about. And historically, these are the issues that voters consider when there's high inflation or when the president is not very popular. But these narratives were relying on national polls, and it looks like this was not a really nationalized election, or at least not as nationalized as we've grown accustomed to seeing in recent elections. The 2022 midterms were not as nationalized as other recent midterm elections, and that is fairly odd in this era of nationalized elections, but really we see that the results varied so much by state. And I think likely that's because which issues were motivating voters did vary by state, which was probably masked by looking just at national polls. So these issues of abortion and democracy seem to have mattered most in states where they were clearly on the ballot. And I can't take credit for this theory. Nate Cohen, the chief political analyst at the New York Times, wrote about this interpretation. And obviously this theory doesn't explain all of the results, but it does explain a lot of the really high profile results we've been hearing most about. And so when I say having abortion on the ballot, I mean that if there was a ballot measure directly on the ballot related to reproductive rights and the right to abortion or access, as there was in California and in Michigan, but it also could mean that voters understood that if a particular candidate won a gubernatorial race, or if a particular party won a majority in their state legislature, then abortion and reproductive rights likely would be in jeopardy in their state. When I say having democracy on the ballot, I mean that if there were candidates who question the legitimacy of results of the 2020 election, or who perpetuate conspiracy theories or lies about the 2020 election, or who promised to conduct elections in a partisan manner, there were several candidates for secretaries of state and for governor who fell into this category this election cycle. So let's take a look at some examples. In Florida, New York, and Virginia, it's arguable that democracy and abortion were not on the ballot. And in those states, Republicans did well, as we'd expect them to do in a midterm election year when the Democratic president isn't popular and voters are worried about inflation. So in New York, for example, Republicans won all but one of their state's competitive congressional districts, and many Republican congressional candidates did much better than former President Trump did in 2020 in those same districts. The governor's race was won by the Democratic incumbent, but it was fairly competitive for a reliably blue state. And the issues of democracy and abortion were not very prominent in New York. New York has a securely Democratic legislature. There wasn't a movement to overturn presidential election results in 2020 in New York, and Republicans really focused on crime and the economy in New York, and it appears to have worked for them. Virginia had no statewide races in 2022, and Republicans did well there as well. So perhaps the rest of the nation would have looked at like Virginia or New York if abortion and democracy hadn't been such motivating issues. But in states where democracy or abortion were on the ballot, states like Michigan or Pennsylvania, Democrats overperformed what we'd historically expect. So in Pennsylvania, Democrats did very well. They won every contested House seat. John Fetterman won the US Senate race. Josh Shapiro won the governor's race. They're both Democrats, and they both won by wider margins than President Biden did in 2020. The Republican candidate for governor, he was viewed by Democrats as a threat to democracy because he was part of efforts to overturn Pennsylvania's 2020 presidential election results. And it also could have put abortion rights at risk because he opposed abortion rights. So abortion and democracy both clearly on the ballot, and Democrats did much better. There were some states where democracy was directly on the ballot in the Secretary of State races. There were several candidates for Secretary of State who falsely claimed that former President Trump won the 2020 election. There were Republican candidates in Nevada, Indiana, Michigan, Arizona, and New Mexico who were making those kinds of partisan statements. They were falsely claiming that President Trump won in 2020, and they were promising to restrict voting access and overhaul the electoral process. And all of those candidates, except for one in Indiana, lost. And that indicates that voters do prefer a less extreme partisan as their Secretary of State. And why is that important? Because secretaries of states are the ones who are most directly responsible for stopping President Trump and his allies from overturning the results in 2020. So they protect election workers, they certify the vote tallies in a nonpartisan way. So those Secretary of State races typically are not high profile races, but they became high profile in this election. And this year there was significant spending on those campaign ads in those states. And in some of those states that had those competitive Secretary of State races, like Michigan and Arizona, again, Democrats did better than expected with other high profile statewide races, not just those Secretary of State races. So in Arizona, we saw Katie Hobbs, the Democratic Secretary of State. She won the gubernatorial seat against Kari Lake, who was an election denier who was backed by Trump. As the Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs was one who defied those efforts to overturn the 2020 results, and that's something she ran on. While Kari Lake was perpetuating and running on lies about the 2020 election, that also likely benefited Mark Kelly, the Democrat who was running for Senate. He was saying he'd be bipartisan. He was trying to distance himself from Biden, and he won won against the Trump-supported candidate who claimed the 2020 election had been stolen. And so again, Arizona's Republican candidate for Secretary of State, he was pushing lies about 2020 election and lost. And again, because democracy was directly on the ballot, that likely also helped some other Democratic candidates in Arizona. Professor has already mentioned Michigan, but yes, again, Democrats did very well there as well. They won the gubernatorial race and they won a majority in their state Senate and state House for the first time in decades. And again, in Michigan, there was a ballot measure to create a state constitutional right to reproductive freedom. And there also was a ballot initiative to increase voting options, such as creating early voting periods and more absentee drop boxes. And again, a state where both abortion and democracy are on the ballot, the Democrats did well. So it looks like there was variation by state in which issues were motivating voters. And that is kind of odd in this area where we have such nationalized elections that the results varied so much by state. But one explanation is this kind of different motivation for voters that varied by state. And so I think it's heartening because voters are actually looking, what's specifically on their ballot, what's important in their state, and we see that their context matters. Lastly, I just want to switch gears a little bit and just note that it is a historic election for women and the LGBTQ+ community in terms of representation in California. So Californians elected Patricia Guerrero. She's the first Latina Chief Justice to the California Supreme Court. And Californians also elected a record number of women and LGBTQ+ people to the state assembly and the state Senate. So we don't know the exact numbers yet, but it looks like we'll have at least 43 female lawmakers. That's out of 120, which is a record for California. And there could be as many as 52. That's still not proportional to the number of women in the population, but it's going in the right direction. So we know that more female lawmakers focus on different types of legislation, such as healthcare, pay equity, family economic issues. So that could shape legislation in California, at least for the next couple of years. It also looks like we'll have at least 8 openly LGBTQ+ candidates that are winning their races. And so that would make California the first state to have a proportional LGBTQ+ legislative representation. And there could be as many as 14 elected. So while it's true that not a lot of surprises in California, at least at the state level, it is worth noting that it was a historic election. And I'll end it there and pass it back to Professor Nalder.
Thank you so much. That's interesting stuff. So just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, put those in the Q&A and we will deal with them at the end of everyone's presentations. So next up, we have Christopher Towler. His research interests broadly include American politics, race and ethnicity, and methodology. Dr. Towler also directs the Black Voter Project Public Opinion Survey, a national survey project of Black Americans, with results highlighted in Politico Magazine, Washington Post, Time Magazine, USA Today, Seattle Times, and The Atlantic. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor Nalder. Thanks again, everyone, for the opportunity to speak today and to share some of my opinions of what I think is interesting related to this midterm election. As was mentioned, I run a public opinion project called the Black Voter Project, where periodically I do statewide and national surveys of Black Americans, both voters and non-voters. And my research has really hinged upon trying to understand Black voter turnout and mobilization, both during the Obama era and in these post-Obama years, and sort of this almost decade now since Obama's tenure. And so my opinions are going to sort of center heavily on African-American politics and what I consider a necessary movement within American politics to continue to mobilize Black Americans if there is to be a progressive movement similar to the one we see now, and that kind of started with the election of President Obama in 2008. And so looking forward, understanding the importance of Black turnout and Black mobilization within American politics is going to be essential to understanding continued Democratic wins, especially in 2024. And so I'm going to discuss a few takeaways from 2022 and really look forward to 2024. But looking forward, Black voter turnout is going to rely upon really one of two things, either racial empowerment or racial threat. And so Black voters have been a major part of the progressive movement, electing Obama and responding to Trump. And so my work trying to understand the ways to mobilize Black voters in this post-Obama era is going to look at whether or not political empowerment or political threat or both are going to sort of be the best strategies. When we think about political empowerment, I'm really talking about descriptive representation or African-American representation that creates a sense of efficacy or a sense of individual importance in politics that then leads to increased interest, turnout, mobilization in politics. However, after President Obama's tenure, few Black candidates, especially Black candidates on the national scale, have offered a similar historical sort of symbolic moment that President Obama did. And in 2012, we actually saw African-American turnout rise to historic heights, where for the first time in measured history, Black turnout was higher than white turnout in 2012. But we've seen a regression to the mean in 2020. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we've regressed even further in this midterm election. When it comes to political threat, we see 2020 generally, not just with Black voters, but with all voters, right, to have continued heightened turnout, not necessarily based on empowerment, but based on the threat of Donald Trump winning the presidency again. And for the Black community, the threat of racism, discrimination, and really outright anti-Black politics. What does that mean now? Well, analyses of the 2022 primaries show a drop in turnout from 2018 in particular. There are a few instances, as were mentioned, where turnout was high in a few battleground states or states with competitive elections. States that actually had higher turnout than 2018 were the state of Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. However, turnout fell compared to 2018 in most other states. It actually reached sort of decade lows of turnout that we saw in like the 2014 midterm in states like West Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Maryland. And so what we're seeing is that turnout is already starting to drop in this midterm election, regardless of sort of Democratic wins or losses or Republican wins or losses. We aren't necessarily sure what to expect going into 2024, as since 2008, we've had constant increase in turnout, where the general election of the latest general election has had higher turnout than the last one. And the same thing goes for the midterm elections. And that trend was kind of broken with this election. And so without a historical candidate on the national ballot, especially for the Democrats in 2024, it's unlikely that there will be this sense of empowerment triggered, especially for Black voters, meaning that, as I discussed, strategies highlighting the GOP's connections to sort of Trump, MAGA, and threat, in particular racial threat, will likely prove to be the most successful. What we also saw in this midterm election is that despite Democratic wins, GOP strategies centered on sort of keeping people from the polls, particularly Black and brown voters from the polls, were successful. And that voter suppression has been another technique that the GOP has relied upon and embraced. And it's played out in a few key midterm elections here. The far right is really making their play to stay relevant within the GOP. We do see successes in this midterm election. About 22% of the total Republican Party has been identified as far right. They're identified by things such as their support for particularly controversial issues, or the candidates' direct membership of Facebook groups or social media groups that are considered far right leaning. And most of these candidates retained office during the midterms. One report found that 97% of fringe candidates who were up for election won their races. There were about 497 victories for these far-right candidates in this midterm election, compared to only 15 losses. And this is compared to an average of about 93% victory rate just for incumbents in general. And so while we do see a GOP looking at these midterm elections and saying, oh, maybe we're not as successful as we wanted to be or we thought we were, the far right wing of the GOP is holding on strong. And these midterm elections are an indication that they're not going to be going anywhere in 2024. And this is something that the GOP is going to have to deal with. And on the other hand, something that the Democratic Party should really look to take advantage of. And most of these candidates, these far right candidates, are running on messages that register as unpopular nationally. Messages such as opposition to abortion rights, limitations to voting access, and many of these candidates also want uncontested races, which is going to be another key thing because they are going to be in place in these state houses, in these local offices in 2024 and relied upon when it comes to garnering support nationally for the party. Thus, more and more states are also working to copy molds from conservative state politics to keep voters uninterested and away from the polls altogether, especially, as I mentioned, Black and brown voters. And so vote suppression and techniques to limit voting have become commonplace within many of these states that have sort of these far right or these very, very conservative leaders. For example, the state of Georgia in these midterm elections saw that kind of work flawlessly and keep the Republican Governor Kemp in office, even though he faced a very sort of competitive and extremely well-organized challenger in Stacey Abrams. Since 2018, Georgia has put into place a number of vote suppression laws, such as laws that eliminated ballot drop boxes, that limited the times that early voting could take place, specifically eliminating early voting on the weekends, making sure that polls were closed on the weekends so that people couldn't early vote, and not allowing resources for voters that waited in line, making it illegal to provide water or food or anything or conversation for those voters that were waiting in line. And so we saw that these techniques, these tactics paid off in Georgia, and Kemp pretty much ran away with that election, even though many consider Stacey Abrams to be one of the most well-organized and competitive sort of statewide candidates in the country when it comes to sort of a Democratic leader. These tactics also are going to now influence the runoff for the state Senate in Georgia. There are two candidates, Warnock and Walker, who were so close in votes that they moved on to a runoff election. And some of the laws passed in Georgia are going to directly affect this, such as Georgia moved its runoff elections from 2 months out to 1 month out. And so now instead of having the runoff 2 months after the midterm election, it's just 1 month after, which again affects things such as the amount of time for people to early vote, and really leaves barely enough time for mail ballots to be sent out, collected, and mailed back. And then we've already talked about limiting ballot drop boxes and access to resources at the polls on those days. And so it's going to be very interesting as these races continue, especially in the state of Georgia, to see how these types of laws, how these regulations, these tactics of vote suppression affect this runoff race. In Georgia, as we mentioned, DeSantis in Florida has become pretty popular there. Georgia has really become the new Florida when it comes to understanding what it means, what it's going to take to win close battleground battles, close battles in states where you have very competitive Democratic and Republican candidates. In addition, though, speaking of Florida, DeSantis in Florida has continued sort of the systematic practice of purging voters from the voter rolls. Some reports have suggested that over 300,000 Floridians were purged from the rolls. People who were Florida residents and had not left the state were kind of purged unnecessarily. And these techniques have again secured DeSantis his majority now, so that he's winning with close to 60% of the vote, where in 2018, he actually had a very tight race with a competitor, an African-American competitor, in Andrew Gillum. And he's only continued to gain popularity and to put in practices limiting people's access to the ballot and to voting. And this is pretty much, I consider this going to be a strategic technique. And now we see states like Wisconsin that have been gaining more and more conservative state houses, and now under conservative rule, trying to copy these. And so Arizona attempted to do a similar law in 2000 in the midterms, limiting the way that ballots could be sent out. That law actually failed, but we're going to see more and more states trying to maintain conservative rule, especially when it's unclear which direction the party is going to be taking, whether it's going to be sort of a Trump MAGA direction or a sort of DeSantis Kemp GOP direction. these techniques of vote suppression, of making it more and more difficult to actually access the ballot, are going to be more and more common across the country. In addition, I feel that by the end of sort of the next two election cycles, the potential to continue to mobilize not, voters in general, but specifically African voters based on a racial threat may be far more difficult. It's going to foster it could likely foster in an area of racial conservatism as Democrats search for the next historic candidate that can create a campaign that also serves as a social movement for Black, Brown, young voters, women voters, voters that traditionally do not turn out at as high of rates. We just learned yesterday, Donald Trump officially announced his candidacy for president. And so there's an opportunity in this election cycle to continue to run against the GOP as a threat. But whether Trump wins or not, by the time 2028 rolls around, it's going to be difficult to continue to pinpoint Trump, MAGA, or the GOP as that threat. And without another candidate, a Democratic candidate that creates a sense of hope or inspiration that is empowering, right? It's very, very likely that the GOP, these candidates like Kemp, candidates like DeSantis, who have found a way to remain extremely conservative, have prioritized limiting access to the ballot box, but have also distanced themselves just enough from Trump to say that they are different. They are not the most extreme of the party, will come into power. They will be the most popular candidates, not just in their states, but across the country. And so as we look forward, I think it's going to be extremely important to continue to watch how states continue to either grant access or limit access to the ballot boxes, and to understand how different the parties, but especially the Democratic Party, strategizes when it comes to turning out non-traditional voters, and when it comes to turning out African-American voters in battleground states like Georgia that face extreme vote suppression, states like North Carolina, states like Wisconsin, right? Madison, the city of Madison, Wisconsin is going to be a key player in 2024 when understanding how that state's going to turn out. And if the state house in Wisconsin continues to pass legislation that makes it more difficult to vote, it's going to be that much more important that Democrats turn out African-American voters, and focusing on the threat that is posed by the GOP, the threat that is posed by Trump, is going to be key, right? And so as I think about my work, understanding American politics in looking forward, those are some of the key points that I take away from this midterm election. And I'd be happy to answer any questions related to that or to the larger projects that I'm doing as we get into the question and answer. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much. All right, next we have Christina Flores Victor. She's an assistant professor of political science here at Sac State as well. Her research focuses on Latino politics within the United States. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to point out for the audience too, I don't know if they can see the comment, but someone placed a comment for us to see. Professor Tyler, his research on Black political mobilization and the politics of threat is also available on a podcast through Chris J, the Building Justice podcast, season 1. So if you want to hear more, you can check that out. I just want to make sure people could see that because I think the comment went to the panelists and not the entire audience. So I'm going to begin by discussing some of the topics and issues that were important for Latinos with regard to the election, just leading up to the election, and then obviously after the election. First of all, registration among Latinos has been increasing, but kind of increasing as the population has been increasing. So overall registration rates for Latinos still lags behind other racial and ethnic groups in terms of the percentage of total eligible voters. It does appear that turnout may have nudged up slightly for Latinos compared to the 2018 midterms, obviously not compared to the 2020 presidential election. According to a poll released right before the election, done by the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, around 29%, just under 30, said that they had voted early. So this is actually a 4% increase from the 2018 midterms. So as Professor Tyler mentioned, the more potentially states see individuals using early turnout or early voter tools, they might kind of start to crack down on these. So Latinos are increasingly voting early. In the polls leading up to the election, the week before the election, the highest interest in voting was actually seen among individuals who identify as Central Americans. Around 73% said that they were definitely going to vote. This is among registered voters. Cubans next, around 71% that they were definitely going to vote, followed by Mexican American and South American, and then Puerto Ricans reported the lowest interest in voting, around 57%. Now, the reason I bring that up is because even though we do have this interest in early voting, we have many registered Latino groups saying that they're going to turn out, there are still major issues with the get out the vote efforts in relationship to the Latino electorate. In the week before the election, in a poll that was done by that same organization, around 50% of Latinos who were surveyed said that they had had zero contact with either a candidate running for office or a party, no contact. So for most of the election, more than half of the Latino potential electorate had not heard from a candidate or party. So there's still this major under mobilization from both party and candidates. It does continue to be an issue for both parties, but of the people who did report that they had had some sort of contact, around 70% said that they were contacted by the Democratic Party or a Democratic candidate, and around 32% said that they had been contacted either by a Republican candidate or the Republican Party. So a major kind of mobilization issue. The top issues for Latinos leading up to the election, and this is going to come in handy in just a second when we talk about how some of the vote turned out. The major top issues for Latinos leading up to the election, the top issue was inflation, and specifically the cost of goods. More Latinos live at or near the poverty line, so any kind of squeeze on wages or prices really impacts this population greatly. The number two issue for the Latino population leading up to the election and potentially when they voted on voting day or early voted was reproductive rights. So this is unusual for the Latino population for reproductive rights to be this high in the kind of like list of policy things that interest them. It's typically not this high. And around 70, depending on the poll and the week it was done, around 70 to 75% of Latinos said that they are in favor of keeping abortion legal. So I think this it kind of contradicts maybe what some of the conventional wisdom was, several months ago, is that Latinos would break for a more conservative position, perhaps due to their Catholicism or maybe more traditional views on the family. But Latinos who were surveyed made a clear distinction between their own personal views and then views of what they thought would be kind of like for society. So 70 to 75% breaking in favor of keeping abortion legal. Rounding out the top five for Latinos were concerns about wages, access to healthcare, and concerns about crime. Now, when they're probed a little bit about concerns about crime, that concern about crime is actually about gun safety. So wanting more kind of protections in terms of gun safety. Immigration does sometimes make it, depending on the week, into the top five. And so I don't want to say that it's not an issue that wasn't important while they were voting, but it definitely wasn't kind of continuously in the top five as we kind of came up on the election. So the overall Latino vote, if we're looking at it kind of overall as a country, broke around 2-1 in favor of Democrats. So in some states, it might have been as high as kind of 64% breaking in favor of Democrats. The state with the best Latino turnout for Republicans was Florida. And in Florida, around 54% voted for the Republican Party. And we're going to talk about Florida in a little bit more detail very quickly, but Florida does tend to be more Cuban, right? Latino population subgroup more Cuban, and they do tend to be older. So I do have some results from particular states. I'm not going to kind of go into a ton of detail on every particular state. I just want to highlight some of the kind of top level findings that are very interesting. So let's talk about Florida though for a second. So Latino voters in Florida, in terms of the governor, broke 40% voted for the Democratic candidate and 58% for the Republican candidate. Now we can break down that Latino vote a little bit because Florida is different. For Cubans, 67% broke for the Republican candidate for governor and 31% for Democrat. So Cubans definitely heavily favoring kind of the Republican Party. But for non-Cuban Latinos, around 46% voted for Democrats and 51% for Republican. So once we kind of move out of that Cuban subgroup, we see that the support drops. And then if we look at Puerto Ricans who live in Florida, around 43% voted for Democrats and around 54% voted for Republicans. So we can see that those other kind of subgroups of Latinos that are not Cuban don't support in the same numbers, but still higher than Latinos living in other states. I think what's potentially one of the more interesting results out of Florida is for Latinos 18 to 29, so that younger set of Latinos in Florida, they actually broke for the Democrats, 56% to 39%. So younger Latinos in Florida actually look a lot more like the national trends for Latinos than they do Latinos living in their own state. And we don't really see much of a gender gap for Latinos in Florida. Both Latinos and Latinas tend to support the Republican Party in similar numbers. I just want to note that in Florida, the top issue for Latinos in Florida was inflation. So that kind of economic issue. Now I want to compare that to the turnout in Texas. So in Texas, for the governor's race, or for the race in Texas, around 57% broke for Democrats and around 40% for Republicans. So we have kind of a flip a little bit of Florida, right? Where we see for the governor's race, the Democrats having more support. But what's really interesting in Texas is if we look at the difference between what type of Latinos voted for governor versus in the House elections. In the House elections, the support for Democrats from Latinos was 64%. So, almost, I can't do math on the fly, a 7-point difference, right? For those, for Latino candidates breaking for Democrats in House elections versus the governor. So we even see, not only does the type of potentially subgroup within the Latino population matter, not only does age matter, but maybe even the office that people are voting for is kind of splitting the vote a little bit. So I do want to note too, in general, the Latino population tends to be about, on average, almost 10 years younger than the general population. And this holds true everywhere except in Florida, where the Latino population is older. So in Texas, we do see a gender gap. So in Texas, around 53% of Latino men voted for Democrats, but 62% of Latina women voted for Democrats. So almost a 10-point gap, a 10-point gender gap, even among Latinos. And here's what's interesting. In Texas, the top issue for Latinos was the abortion issue. And that might help us explain some of that gender gap. We do see kind of this pretty consistent, almost 10-point gender gap between Latinos and Latinas in all their states, except for Florida. So just to kind of go along with some of what we've already talked about, Latino voters in Arizona voting in the governor's election, around 51% of Latinos voted for Democrats. But again, the vote share for the House elections was around 63%. So we see potentially some people doing split ticket voting for the governor and the House. So the House elections actually had a much higher percentage of Latinos voting for the Democrats than in the governor's elections. In Nevada, which was another very kind of closely contested election, around 62% of Latinos voted for the Democratic candidate and 37% for the Republican. So the races are closer here, and that Latino vote is actually kind of making a difference. A state where Latino vote, people believe had a real impact was the Senate race in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, Latinos broke 67% for Democrats and 31% for Republicans. So just as a point of reference for you, in California, the break was 67% in favor of the Democrats and 31% in favor of the Republicans. So Pennsylvania looks a lot like California in this particular election, if we're kind of comparing across. Also, kind of one thing, a high point to note is that we see the election of the first Afro-Latino Gen Z member of Congress out of Florida's 10th district. He's 25 years old, so this might appeal to the younger voters in Florida, thinking about upcoming elections in the future. Going back to kind of a more general view of the election, we do see that spending on media buys for both Democrats and Republicans in Spanish language media has increased in this last midterm election, so kind of increasing over time. Democrats are still outspending Republicans in terms of ad buys. I think in summary, I have two kind of notes for in summary. If you look at around a 20-year period or so, maybe going back to the late 1990s, the early 2000s, support for the Democratic Party among Latinos has remained relatively stable, somewhere around the 60%, some years just over, some years Republicans do a little better, some years Democrats do a little better, but it's held relatively stable, around 60% break in favor of the Democrats, around, high 30s for Republicans. So sometimes when we hear these conversations about, Republicans are making inroads with Latinos, I think that we need to be careful that, one election does not make a trend, right? So it'd be better for us to take a longer view of kind of how Latinos have broken over time. And it does seem to be a lot more stable, right, in favor of kind of the Democratic Party. And what this means for future elections, I think one of the main issues when we think about like the Latino vote as this monolith is this massive under mobilization. That seems to be a major issue. And what that's going to take is it's a year-round issue. Parties and candidates can't just ignore mobilization and then right before the election kind of attempt to go into Latino communities looking for votes, right? A very kind of reliable block to vote. I think this is especially important, especially given what Professor Thaler said, with states that are beginning to have more and more restrictions on registration times or what you need for registration. This mobilization effort is potentially going to need to look different, right, in different states, depending on what types of laws they've enacted. And the mobilization may need to start much earlier, right? If you have states that have 30-day periods, 28-day periods, 29-day periods with a bunch of paperwork and residency requirements, then the mobilization needs to start months, if not like entire year before the general election. So that's it for me.
Wonderful, thank you. So we will have kind of a lightning round. We don't have a lot of time left, but we have some questions from the audience. So one is, with Trump announcing that he's running for president again, will the issue of democracy still be on the ballot 2 years from now? And then related to that, we had election deniers lose. Why are they not denying this election? Who wants to take it?
I can start off on that one. So to the first question, is democracy going to continue to be on the ballot? Obviously, I'm not going to make official predictions, but it is more likely that it will continue to be on the ballot if Donald Trump is on the ballot. It seems clear he probably will continue to deny election results or at least call them into question. And then as to the second question about, well, are they denying this election? And yes, some of them are. So Carrie Lake, for example, has already called the election into question in Arizona, raising some concerns about, was there voter fraud, things like that. So far with nothing legitimate, but of course they're still going to question it. And we also see a lot of those same election deniers not conceding or admitting that they have lost the election, which also can be detrimental to voters having confidence in the elections as well.
Quick question. What's the reason that Puerto Ricans in Florida are favorably disposed towards the Republican Party?
I mean, it could be a lot of reasons, right? It could just be that they live in a state where there's a lot of like kind of Republican leadership and Republican people in office. Puerto Ricans that live in New York look very different, right? So it could be kind of a selection effect of who lives in Florida, but when we kind of control for things like age and income, they don't, right? They look like Puerto Ricans living other places too. So I think there's potentially a lot of different explanations for that.
Thank you. Professor Hussey, will you touch on why California is one of the last remaining states to count their vote for the House of Representatives, and why did Florida get their results in quicker?
Yeah, we do something that's really smart for election security, but really dumb for the results of how they come out, which is, we're basically a mail balloting state now. And anytime you turn in a mail ballot, whether you turn it into a box, whether you mail it in, an election official has to check your signature to the signature that you initially signed. And that takes a lot of time. And also California has a rule that if that signature doesn't match right, or if you don't put your signature, they have to make an effort to contact you to say, oh, is there an issue here? Can you fill it out? Now, that second part is not really a huge concern, but imagine the entire state is voting by mail, and every single person's mail ballot has to be at least checked by one person to make sure your signature looks like you did 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And it causes a real problem. Other states that have mail balloting don't require this additional check, which is why they're able to get their election results clear. It also means the chance for fraud in California is basically nil. It's basically nil everywhere else, but it's almost impossible to happen here. But it really delays the results because we're a giant state and we're having people literally check every single vote that comes in.
Interesting. Professor Towler, will we see federal voting laws pushed more as a result of the suppression efforts that you talked about? Your
also
mic is
speak
off.
to the-
Oh, there we go. We heard you for a second, but no. I don't know. We're not hearing you for some reason. There we go.
It says I'm muted now.
Go ahead. We can hear you now.
All right. I wanted to speak to both the democracy on the ballot question and this question. I think that it's going to be tough for federal voting laws to be pushed in these next 2 years coming up to a presidential election cycle, because the Biden administration is kind of already out of that first year, 100-day first year, possibly 2-year period of really getting anything done legislatively. Most of their efforts are going to now have to go towards re-election and making sure that they, if Biden runs again, runs a very sort of strategic campaign, and that starts almost immediately after these midterm elections. And they have less control over both the House and the Senate. And so it's far less likely that they're going to be able to get anything done federally when it comes to voting rights if it was not a policy priority from the beginning of Biden's term. And so as much as we might have wanted to see it happen, the fact that it hasn't already happened just means it's going to be tougher and tougher for it to happen. I do believe democracy is going to be on the ballot again, but unfortunately, some of my other research suggests that that's not quite enough to get people out to vote. And that if we really want to mobilize around this issue of democracy, it has to be far more specific. And the threat isn't just a threat to democracy, but it needs to be a threat to your community. And so, for example, with the Latinx community, it needs to be framed as a democratic threat through anti-immigration efforts, something that really resonates with that community. Or for the Black community, a anti-democratic threat through vote suppression, or through some policy issue that is very specific and directly related to the community. And so, the opportunity is there, especially if Trump and the MAGA movement push hard and remain in play. But as I said, these opportunities are few and far between, and we have to really focus on mobilization and figuring out how to continue to keep people out at the polls to keep the progressive movement alive for this foreseeable future.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot about Gen Z making a difference in this election. Are there different techniques that were used to try to motivate them to vote? Is it really bigger turnout for Gen Z? What difference might they make in the next election? I don't have a specific person I'm asking this to.
I can mention one thing. I think like when we saw in the case of the first kind of Afro-Latino Gen Z person elected to the House, one of the things that parties could do was select younger candidates, right? The overall age of the Senate and the House skews older than the general population. And so one potential thing that parties could do is run younger candidates, right? To have people, younger voters tend to like have different preferences for things in terms of reproductive rights, the environment, wages and jobs, housing, right? And so having candidates who are echoing those kind of concerns might help with get out the vote efforts among like younger groups.
Thank you so much. Well, it turns out we are running out of time. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We will have a recording of this posted on the Project for an Informed Electorate's website later today. So if you want to share this with anyone else who didn't show up, we will have that available. And don't forget that there is the upcoming event from the Center for California Studies that's in the chat if you're interested in that. And thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.